Now, in this connection, there's a rather interesting question of what we may call interpretation, which arises. We've spoken of the Buddha's experience of enlightenment as constituting the nature, the essence of Buddhism. We've spoken of the Buddha communicating or trying to communicate that experience of his to others so that they also might have that experience for themselves. And we've spoken of Buddhism as essentially this communication. But we have also to take note of the fact, of the point, that in communicating his experience, his spiritual experience, his transcendental experience, whatever we may like to call it, the Buddha had perforce to make use of contemporary language. This is something we don't always appreciate, or don't always appreciate very clearly or very definitely. Of course, he had to use, we all know, a contemporary Indian language. It wasn't Pali, it was probably Magadhi or Kosalese or something of that sort. No doubt he spoke several languages or dialects. But isn't that merely that one means? He had to express himself, he had to communicate what he had to communicate, his experience of enlightenment, in terms of contemporary language, not just in the linguistic sense, philological sense, but also in the sense of ideas. And this brings us to another very interesting and very important question of interpretation. Some scholars, some historical scholars, dealing with Buddhism, sometimes make the statement that the Buddha borrowed such and such an idea from his predecessors. For instance, you can open some little popular books on Buddhism, and they'll tell you almost on the first page that the Buddha borrowed the idea of karma and rebirth from existing religious traditions. Sometimes, of course, they'll also tell you that it didn't fit in very well with his own discoveries, but that's neither here nor there. But this sort of way of looking at things, one might say, is extremely crude and extremely superficial. The Buddha's purpose, the Buddha's aim, was to make himself understood. So when you speak to people, you have to use their language, not just in the linguistic sense, but the language of ideas which is familiar to them. So when the Buddha spoke to people in India, in northeastern India mainly, 500 BC, though his experience was beyond words, beyond thought even, though it was something in a sense incommunicable, when he wanted to communicate something of it, to suggest it, to convey some hint of it at least, he had not only to use the language in the literal sense of his day, or languages, but also the language of ideas which was understood by the people to whom he was speaking. Of course, he used that language of ideas, in his own way, and no doubt in using it, modified it, sometimes entirely reinterpreted it. To give just a couple of very simple sociological examples, he reinterpreted the word Brahmana. Brahmana in the Buddha's day meant usually just a priest, a hereditary priest. But the Buddha reinterpreted this term, this word, and made it stand for a very high spiritual ideal. In the same way, Vassala. Vassala meant an outcast, in the literal sense. But the Buddha used it in the sense of an unworthy person, a spiritually degenerate person. So in this way, he transformed the meaning of many of the terms which he used.